Welcome back, AP, to your second of two flips about imperialism going on during the late 1800s, right? We talked a little bit in the last flip to review a couple of key concepts. Hold on, let me put my timer on so I know that I'm not taking up too much of y'all's time. But the big things that we talked about in the last flip, right? We talked about the growth of this concept of new imperialism, right? Coming off the heels of technological development, medicinal development, transportation development from the Industrial Revolution, right? We talked about the progression of weapons, and then we talked about the opening of China by the British forces going into the First Opium War, and then, of course, yet again in the Second Opium War, and the establishment of these things called spheres of influence in China, which is basically one of the most screwed up things in history that's ever occurred. And we're also going to talk about some other screwed up stuff that actually occurred during this time period as well, because I honestly think, like I said, I think that imperialism is on par with as many global atrocities as we've seen or studied in other classes and in the past, right? And then we talked about a flip side of the coin, right? We left off right here. Oh, by the way, fun fact, the blue dot is back.
This is your celebration.
So it's very important that the blue dot is back because I figured out how it actually works. I have to open it up in presenter view, which is a little bit annoying, but I'll figure it out. Now, the big thing, though, going forward is that you have to understand that when witnessing the Opium Wars and also the forced opening of the Chinese economy by the British and by these other modern developed European states as well as the Americans, right? So it's very, very important for us to understand that we also were involved in some of these disgusting crises. Now, the big thing, though, going into it, is that Japan is going to witness this and they're going to choose to industrialize rather than fight against this global expansion of these powers, right? To try and make themselves into one of the powers rather than actually being subject to them, right? So, which is actually going to play itself out very, very interestingly enough, if any of you have ever wondered why Japan was so heavily involved in World War II as well as post-World War I, right? So, a lot of it comes from this, during this period known as the Meiji Restoration and the modernization of Japan, right? So, of course, it had a giant headway in the Russo-Japanese War. Now, the next one that we're going to talk about is one that I have studied very, very intently and is very, very near and dear to my heart, and that is the that is the European imperialization of Africa, right? So now to get some kind of context, you need to understand European imperialization of Africa had a lot of early causes early on rather than necessarily being something that jumped out of nowhere, right? European involvement in Africa had existed since the 1490s, right? Like that is something we need to be very aware of, is that it's not like China where it's like they saw somebody who was economically prosperous and they wanted to stop spending so much money on tea, so they sold people drugs, which again is one of the most screwed up things on the planet. And I know Angelina Merkel's just shaking her fist in anger right now. The big thing you need to understand, though, is that European involvement in African societies had existed going into the slave trade, and then also, even though the slave trade had been illegalized by this point, because it's actually going to be illegalized in the early 1800s, especially by the British, and then by the Portuguese later on, even though it was made illegal by this point, there's still remnants of heavy involvement of Europeans, right? But this is what it looked like in 1880, which is not a ton of heavy involvement, right? You've got some caliphates, which means it's ruled over by a Muslim empire. You have some other tribal areas and things like that. You have Algeria, which is owned by France. You have Morocco. You have Egypt, which is actually a territory of the Brits by this point. But notice there's these giant areas that are unclaimed. Well, by 1914, this is what Africa would look like, right? By 1914, over 90% of Africa was controlled or owned by a European nation. That is insanity to me, okay? To go from this to this in such a short span of time is absolutely mind-blowing, right? And there's a lot of reasons why it happened, right? Now, biggest reasons why it happened is going back to the technology, weaponry, medicinal use, and transportation, right? Going back to those things, Europeans now had the ability to explore great areas of territory because they were technologically superior, right? They had steamboats that could navigate rivers. They had guns now that could fire at high rates. They also now had medicine that could stave off the symptoms of malaria, right? So they now had the ability to explore or go into Africa. I use the word explore very loosely here. To go into Africa without the idea of being killed by African tribes and or by like being killed by a mosquito, right? So they decide to start exploring the uncharted areas of Africa. Those areas include mostly what is known as the interior, right? So that is why they're going to begin to go to these areas as of 1880. It's actually much more like the 1860s, the 1870s, right? Roger Livingston is a very, very prominent one who was looking for the source of the Nile, right? He was looking for where the Nile River came from, and on the way, he was a Irish missionary who, along the way, attempted to try and convert as many people to Christianity as possible, right? That is going to become something very, very heavy, very large theme that is going to kind of exist going forward in this flip as well. And then one of the ultimate tool bags in all of history is named Henry Morton Stanley. And if you, I can't stand this guy. Henry Morton Stanley tried to discover the source of the Congo, and he is a huge scumbag. And his trying to discover the source of the Congo is actually going to lead to the death of hundreds of Africans because they literally just carried him on a chair through all of their homeland and territory, and they're going to die from gross exhaustion while he sits on an elephant or in a chair carried by other people, right? Like, such a tool, right? But his expedition actually happened in 1876. And another big thing about his expedition is he actually went on an expedition to find David Livingstone. Oh, it's not Rogers Livingston. It's David Livingstone. I'm an idiot. It's David Livingstone, right? And so the big thing about that is he's actually going to go on a mission to try and find him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he actually does end up finding him. Mr. Livingstone, I presume, blah, 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 blah. But yeah, so it's David Livingstone, not Roger Livingston. A little typo right there. Sorry about that. But again, Henry Morton Stanley, huge scumbag. Not even his real name. He actually was a British, orphan who then moved to New Orleans, ironically enough, and then adopted the name of this guy that he worked for and all this other weird stuff, even though the guy that he worked for didn't really like him. But we're not getting into why I don't like Henry Morton Stanley right now, okay? But this exploration idea is going to lead to trying to discover these uncharted areas, right? Because and something you need to understand, true ball, man, I can't spell. Europeans, and the ultimate irony, I spent 4 hours working on this the last 4 hours. So Europeans had very little trouble taking over any territory that they wanted due to their massive technological advances, and now also due to the massive advantage of understanding the territory, the terrain, and the charting of Africa and the mapping of it by guys like these two, right? So the discovery and the process of these exploration movements are going to be things like copper, gold, rubber, ivory, diamonds, palm oil. They're going to discover that Africa happens to be a very, 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 very rich, large continent full of things that maybe the Africans aren't using, but the Europeans really want, right? The biggest ones on this including gold, rubber being one of the biggest ones, diamonds, and palm oil actually are going to cause a massive race for territory. So when Europeans find out that there are all these great raw materials that they want inside of a continent that is inhabited mostly by tribal groups, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to begin to race for these territories. And that is going to lead to a lot of possible violence, right? A lot of the Europeans are going to try and grab up as many pieces as they can get their hands on. As going back looking at this map real quick, you can see the British here in blue claim a massive area, the French claim a massive area, but to prevent the outbreak of war and to prevent the outbreak of fighting between Europeans over African land, there's going to be a meeting in Berlin called the Berlin Conference in 1884. Very important. Put a star next to it. It's huge, okay? So the 1884 Berlin Conference held by Otto von Bismarck, it's one of the biggest knocks against him, I'm not even going to lie. Because guess how many African officials were invited to the Berlin Conference? None, right? So no African officials were invited to the Berlin Conference whatsoever. And basically what they did was they carved up Africa and gave it to each other to prevent warring over these different areas. And in the Berlin Conference, one of the most wicked people in all of history named King Leopold II is going to get his free state actually organized and inducted in as the Belgian monarch of the Congo, blah, blah, blah. He's such a piece of crap. Now, anyway, but the major effects of this Berlin Conference and this thing known as the Scramble for Africa, jot that down. This was called the Scramble for Africa, and the trying to find and grab up as many raw material producing rich territories in Africa as possible is going to be a lot, right? So first and foremost, one of the biggest ones is going to be forced Christian conversion, right? The Christian missionaries are going to be coming in and they're going to begin to impress their religion upon Africans who have no idea what it is and have no really want or reason to understand what it is, but they feel like they must adopt it to prevent violence being enacted upon them, right? And then also you're going to have a massive amount of African resistance, right? You're going to have African tribes unite together to try and actually go against this massive European incursion, right? 5,000, one very particular one that actually occurred in South Africa was 5,000 Africans versus 50 British people and 4 Maxim guns, right? And over 50% of that 5,000 African people died because they had wooden shields and spears going up against 4 guns that can fire 200 rounds per minute, right? So these 50 British guys, not one of them even twisted an ankle, right? So like they actually had no casualties whatsoever. A very sick and disgusting poem came out after imperialism, and it was actually very flaunted by British people saying, whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not, right? That is so screwed up. But literally, it's how these people viewed themselves as this overwhelming force, and also that they're there to save them, right? Mission civil thrust, like all this other stuff. And then what also is going to happening is fighting between European countries over African land, right? So you have one called the Fashoda Crisis that actually almost broke out between France and Great Britain over the South Sudan, right? You also had one known as the Boer Wars, which actually broke out between Dutch descendants in South Africa and between the British, right? And the British had found out that in these places called the Orange Free State and the Transvaal State that they recognized as countries, then they found out that there was diamonds and gold under it. And so they went after these people known as the Boers. And the Boers were European descendant white people that spoke a very interesting language known as Afrikaans, right? Which was actually a blending of African languages and Dutch languages put together. But these Boers were herders and like cow herders and sheep herders and stuff like that that lived in South Africa for a few generations because the Dutch had actually come down and colonized that entire area earlier on. Now, a big thing to understand, though, is that the Boer Wars are going to result in the British taking over that entire area and then recognizing South Africa as their own, right? And taking it away from the Dutch completely. You're also going to see the enforcement and dissemination of racist ideology, right? Basically, this is going to give credence to the ideas laid out in Darwin's Descent of Man, laid out in this Mission Civil Strauss, laid out in this idea of forcing Christian conversion, right? That is really, really going to reinforce the ideas of racism back in Europe against people of African descent. And then also, I'm not going to put this lightly, you're going to see genocide, right? Now, genocide is going to occur. The biggest example of it is the Belgian conquest of the Congo, which we are going to talk about in class because I do not want to take time away talking about it speedily on a flip. I think it deserves to be talked about intensely, right? But the Belgian conquest of the Congo is going to lead to the death of 10 million Africans over the course of almost 20 years, over ivory and rubber reserves, right? So like over 2 things, over 2 products, 10 million people are going to die. That's not even accounting for the number of births and miscarriages that happen because of the population decline in the Belgian Congo, right? And then another huge one that ends up occurring, of course, is the British imperialism of India, right? So now, the beginning of European influence dates all the way back to like 1497. And that's all going to go all the way back to Vasco da Gama finding his way around the Cape of Good Hope, making it all the way to Calicut, trading things for spices, bringing that black pepper all the way back, making a buttload of money off of it, right? Now, India is an interesting area because it straddles the line between the old imperialism, which is your colonialism, and your new imperialism, which is your military redistricting and taking over of these places. So colonization efforts of all the EICs, especially the British ones, kicked in going into the 1600s, right? Because you had a Dutch East India Company, you had a British company, or the British East India Company, you had the French East India Company, you had a Portuguese company that set up over 200 military bases all over the shores of the Indian subcontinent, right? Well, the thing about it is in the 1500s, these East India companies did not have the ability to push into India because they were controlled by a very large empire known as the Mughal Empire, right? Mughal, right? And the Mughal Empire was very, very large and very, very strong and militarily militarily very dominant, okay? But as time goes on and as the British begin to imperialize, and after the 7 Years' War, this is going to tip the scales, right? Because the British are going to beat basically everybody in the 7 Years' War, but particularly going to beat the French. When this occurs, the British then begin deliberately using their military, well, not their military, the East India Company military, to take over large swaths of land in India, right? They take over Bengal, they take over areas near Delhi, they take over large areas of the British or the Indian subcontinent. And then they begin to practice this thing known as indirect rule, right? Where the British would actually leave local rulers in charge, okay? Because at the height of the British control, the East India Company control of India, there were less than 1,000 British rulers that lived there, ruling over 300 million Indians. And why would the Indian, upper class, and why would the Indians listen to this and actually agree to rule over their own people under British flags and under British dictation? Well, one of the biggest reasons why is because when the British came in, you got to remember that India was so fragmented into a lot of different areas, controlled mostly by princes and aristocrats, right? And so they made deals with these princes and aristocrats saying that if you allow us to grow things here and do these things here, you will make money also, right? And so a lot of these upper class Indians are going to benefit off the relationship with the British, off the rulership of the British early on and mostly before 1850, right? And also the British are going to think that they're doing good things, right? They're going to think they are, but they're not, all right? So they're going to do one thing in particular where they just try to destroy this thing known as the caste system, right? Now, the caste system is the social system incorporated in the Hindu religion, right? The way the caste system works is it is the reinforcement behind their religious idea of reincarnation, right? So let's say hypothetically, I was born as I'm not even going to try to say this, as I was born as a farmer, right? Or a trader or a merchant. I would be the third in this caste system, okay? Well, since I was born here, that means that in my past lives, I had not led the best life I possibly could have, right? Maybe I was a laborer and then I led a good life and so I bumped up to the farmer class, right? But if I continue to lead a good life, I'll bump up in my next life after I die and I'm reincarnated into the warrior class, and then I'll bump up into the Brahmin class. Well, the British wanted to get rid of this, not mainly because they thought it was heretical and heresy towards Christianity. Well, that's a part of it. But they also wanted to get rid of it because they believed they were enlightened and they were trying to spread their enlightened civil straws, white man's burden garbage to the Indians, right? And originally because there was a very low rung of the caste system, and they were known as the Dalits, or the untouchables, right? And so the British were like, oh, we're going to get rid of the caste system, even though it's heavily enforced by your religion, right? So this is going to anger a huge number of local Indians. So it's important to keep that in the back of your mind, right? They're also going to improve roads, which that actually was pretty beneficial, but the roads you were improving cut through forests, destroyed farmland, so you could just get things to ports as fast as possible. So they're going to destroy people's homes that they had lived on for hundreds of years. And they thought they were doing good things, but they're not, right? And they also tried to improve women's place in society by outlawing this thing known as sati, right? Sati is spelled S-U-T-T-I, all right? So sati is the idea that a good Hindu wife would actually kill herself and burn upon her funeral pyre with her husband, right? So if her husband were to die before her, she would die with him, right? So to us, in the first world American ideologue, we're looking at this like, maybe that's a good thing that they got rid of that. Again, though, you're coming in and impressing your values and your ideas on a different group of people that have used these cultural things to back up their religion for thousands of years, right? You can't come in and tell them that they were wrong or evil the entire time. Now, granted, I don't want my wife to, do that if something happened to me, yes, but, you can't tell them that they were wrong. But then what's going to end up happening, the British are going to become heavily involved. They're going to then begin to do way worse things, right? They try to get rid of the caste system, which could be argued to be good or bad, right? They try to get rid of sati, which could be argued to be good or bad, but you are, again, forcing your cultural ideas onto somebody else. So they're then going to begin to force Christian laws, right? And you're forcing Christian laws in a country that has Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims that live there, right? They're going to then begin to burn down and deforest India for fields, the creation of railroads, and the creation of roads, right? And they're going to look the other way while Indians starve during a famine. Since the British brought medicine and other different things to different diets, different goods, different crops to India, their life expectancy actually went up. And now some of you are probably thinking to yourselves like, well, isn't that a good thing that people weren't dying as fast? Well, yes, it is. But then when famine broke out, because the British were too busy saying, hey, don't grow things like food, grow things like cotton and drugs for us. They actually ran out of food reserves because the fields were not being used to grow food for Indians. They were being used to grow cash crops for the British. So when famines broke out and thousands and thousands and thousands of Indians began to starve to death under East India Company rule, now this is still East India Company rule, the British are just going to look the other way. And they're going to be like, oh, well, they'll figure it out, right? So they also are then going to force the drafting of sepoys into their military. A sepoy is a Indian-born soldier that is being forced to fight in the East India Company army, right? And in the process of doing this, realizing they could make even more money if these pesky indirect rulers weren't around, these Rajas and princes, they're then going to begin to dethrone, strip land, and take away princely rights from the people that they used to infiltrate Indian society with in the first place. That's right. The East India Company, they used those Rajas to infiltrate Indian society and use their profit and their land to be like, hey, help us out, we'll help you out. And then after 1850, they're going to start stripping that land and those rights away, being like, oh, well, we got your use out of you now. We have already now controlled this entire subcontinent, so we're just going to take all your stuff. And they're going to use it to farm cash crops like cotton, tea, and opium. That's where the opium came from that they then sold to the Chinese in the Opium Wars, right? Like, don't grow things like food, whatever. Now, anyway, so then the British Raj is going to take over. Because of the aggressive rule of the East India Company, it caused a massive revolt that we're going to talk about probably in class in 1857, right? In 1857, a huge revolt broke out that claimed thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of lives, right? So, and Queen Victoria saw this happening and said, this is not efficient, it is not proper, and she took over rulership of the British, or of British India, and it became known as the British Raj, right? So you have to understand that pre-1858, the East India Company ruled over India for the British government, but now after 1858, the British then directly rule over them, and Victoria became what is known as the Empress of India, right? And now, just so you understand how directly oppositional and screwed up all this stuff is, it's very important to look at just like a map of railroads, right? So these right here are railroads in the German Empire leading up to World War I. Look how the railroads go to city centers and bring industrial goods to cities and factories. Look at the railroads in India. They're actually being used to go to the outskirts of the entire country so they can rip their raw materials and rip their goods from them, right? So this is just a map of how screwed up imperialism is. And are there going to be massive reactions to this? Of course, right? There are going to be massive reactions to imperialism, including violent revolts, which we will talk about in class when you come back from Easter break. And there's also going to be reactions from Europeans, okay? Some Europeans will look at this and be like, this is wrong. This is messed up. This is screwed up. This is so unfair. And the biggest one that I like to talk about is known as the Congo Reform Association, right? And that was led by this guy named E.D. Morel and Roger Casemont, right? And Roger Casemont and E.D. Morel would unite together to create the Congo Reform Association because their direct exposure of the Congo slave systems that were being used by Leopold II in his genocidal maniac forms of trying to extract rubber and ivory from the Belgian Congo would be the thing that makes the Belgian government strip rule from Leopold himself and actually give it to the Belgian government instead. They exposed a genocide going on in Central Africa, and it directly tried to lead to the betterment of the Africans that live there, right? So like, and tried to stop slavery and stop direct servitude of the Belgian government over them, right? So it's important to talk about those things, and we will talk about the violent uprisings that happened in reaction to imperialism, and we'll actually talk about more about the Congo Reform Association, as well as the Belgian conquest of the Congo in class. So I'll talk to you guys about that then. Y'all have a great rest of your Easter break. We are going to have a quiz on both of these flips the day you come back. 10-question multiple choice quiz. Very, very easy as long as you've been paying attention. But I'll see y'all guys then. Y'all have a great one.